Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Hintz, and I'm a historian with the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of our three-day webinar series, Immigration and Innovation, New Perspectives. Before I introduce our session moderator, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items and the mechanics of how we'll run the Zoom's webinar. For the best viewing experience, we recommend launching the webinar directly in the Zoom app versus viewing through Eventbrite on your web browser. Either way, the upper right corner of your Zoom screen has a small square and some dots that say View. We would recommend selecting the speaker view. That will maximize the speaker slides on your screen. And once we switch to our panel discussion, you may want to change that to Panel View. There is a control panel that runs across the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please select the closed caption button if you'd like to view the live transcription of the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to pose questions for our panelists. You can start posing your questions at any time. They will go into a queue and the moderator will try to get to as many of your questions as time permits. Please use the chat feature to share observations and engage in conversation with your fellow attendees. There's a drop-down box and we encourage you to share your observations with both the panelists and the audience. With your questions and remarks in the chat, we thank you for adhering to the Smithsonian's Code of Conduct so we can maintain a respectful learning environment. Finally, we are recording the session, but please be assured that attendees' cameras and microphones will be disabled during the webinar. After some captioning and post-production, we do plan to post these videos to the event website and to the Lemelson Center's YouTube channel in just a few days. As I mentioned, the Lemelson Center is located within the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The center was founded in 1995 thanks to the philanthropic support of the inventor Jerome Lemelson and his family. The Lemelson Center strives to educate and empower the public to participate in technological, economic, and social change. By drawing on and contributing to the Smithsonian's world-leading collection of artifacts and archives, the Lemelson Center's scholarship, exhibitions, educational initiatives, and public programming like this advance the historical study of invention and innovation, encourage children and adults to apply their curiosity to real-world problems, and showcase the diversity of inventors who have shaped world history. And we invite you to learn more about our work at invention.si.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Monica Smith, and she, in turn, will introduce the themes of the session and today's speaker. My colleague, Monica M. Smith, is the head of exhibitions and interpretation for the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation. She oversees conceptual and logistical planning for our exhibitions. She has served as project director, principal investigator, and co-curator for our in-progress Game Changers exhibition, which looks at invention and technology in sports, and that's expected in 2023. And she's also the lead on our award-winning Places of Invention exhibition, which is currently on view at the National Museum of American History. And she also directed the earlier award-winning Invention at Play traveling exhibition. All three of these exhibitions received prestigious multi-million-dollar grants from the National Science Foundation. So we're pleased that she can direct us today, and I welcome Monica Smith to take it away. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks so much, Eric. Very nice, kind introduction. It's my honor to get to introduce our two featured inventors today. In no particular order, but I will start with Dr. Ashok Gadgil. He's a longtime friend of the Lemelson Center. I met him over 20 years ago, and he is a distinguished professor of safe water and sanitation in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Berkeley. He's also a faculty senior scientist in the energy technologies area of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He has several patents and inventions, including one that will be featured later, and more than 140 scientific publications to his credit. Dr. Gadgil is recipient of numerous awards and honors for his work, including the Lemelson MIT Global Innovator Award and induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, as well as election to the National Academy of Engineering. And second, we have Ayah Bdeir. She's an entrepreneur, engineer, and social activist. She is the inventor of Little Bits, the electronic building block that has transformed STEM education for millions of kids around the world. For over a decade, Bdeir's work has centered around empowering everyone to be an inventor, very akin to the Lemelson Center's mission, by modularizing and democratizing electronics, by pioneering new ways of learning through play, and by reimagining the relationship between technology and creativity. Bdeir has been particularly focused on empowering underrepresented communities, especially girls, with the tools to become tomorrow's change makers. Bdeir has also received numerous awards and holds over a dozen patents, and her inventions are included in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And she graduated from MIT Media Lab and the American University of Beirut. So with that, I'm going to turn to them. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll enter into I hope, and I'm sure will be a fascinating Q&A. So please take it away, Ashok. You're muted, Ashok.
Yeah, okay, good. Better now. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored to be speaking at this event. In very short 5 minutes, here is a story of how I am here on this panel today. I grew up in Mumbai in a 900 square foot apartment occupied by between 6 and 8 people, depending on the number of guests we would have living with us. I went to school there. I was in India until I was 23 years old. I was tremendously excited and interested in physics all along my childhood. But my heroes, if I may say so, were not really inventors at that time. They were people like Feynman and Einstein. And I would read a lot about Oppenheimer and the debates around the atom bomb. I was curious about how the world works. And the most fundamental way to understand it, I thought, was by studying physics, and I was very good at it. So I came to the United States to get a PhD in physics because this was the very best place. The United States had and still has the very best universities in the world. It's truly amazing how we have maintained it. I applied for and got into almost every university with full ride, and I selected Berkeley because I knew it was a wide and deep ocean of knowledge, not just a narrow technical one alone, but anything ever that was being taught, if I wanted to learn, it was here being offered by some of the topmost scholars. Over some period of time, I figured out that just learning physics is what I wanted. I wanted to see how I could make the world a little better. After my PhD, my wife, she's also from India, we went back to India, trying to apply to India what I had learned in Berkeley. After 5 years of struggle, I decided I couldn't fight the bureaucracy. I'll get defeated and become a fossil, a living fossil. So I wrote back to Berkeley and said, you know, I gave it a fair shot. 5 years is a long time in anyone's life. I want to come back. And they said, sure. So here I am.
That's great, Ashok. Thank you for that great introduction. Now we'll turn to Ayah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for putting this panel together on an important topic. I will tell you a bit of my story and how I got to be where I am. I grew up in Beirut, Lebanon, tiny country in the Middle East. I was always a tinker. I would take things apart. I would disassemble VCRs. I was always, trying to see how things worked. And I was good at math and science. And so my parents and my teachers said that I owed it to myself to be an engineer. I always was an inventor. I actually realized this kind of in retrospect. I remember having a little book of inventions where anytime I would encounter something inefficient or silly or some kind of new idea, I would draw little sketches. I'm a very bad drawer, but I would draw sketches of ideas that I had, and I was really enamored with invention. And so I did follow the lead of my teachers and parents, and did engineering for my undergrad at the American University of Beirut. But my schooling I found to be very dry. It was a lot about multiple choice. It was a lot about memorizing. I was really unhappy, and I started to think that I hated engineering. I took on a minor in sociology, and I found that there was so much more sort of relationship to society and how structures, inventions, contributions, human contributions affect society, and that became much more interesting to me. And I felt that engineering was really removed from that. But I stuck with it, and I, continued till I graduated. And then when time came for, to finish my schooling and do my master's, I was almost going to sort of leave the field and go into design until I found the Media Lab at MIT. And I realized that there was a way to bring together engineering and society and really be able to sort of bring together the idea of invention for social good and invention for art and activism purposes. So I actually only applied to the Media Lab at MIT. I didn't apply to any other school. And I was lucky to be able to be accepted and get a scholarship to go there. And it really did change my life. I started getting very interested in all sorts of different types of invention, always with a focus on its social mission. I did my thesis project was a wearable. This was, in 2005. So it was a wearable suit that you wore under your clothes when you traveled as an immigrant, so that you could record the search process on your body when you get patted down. So in this case, it was an invention to help sort of measure whether discrimination or whether there was any kind of sort of abuse happening, particularly to immigrants at the border. I made another wearable piece that was sort of a fashion tech piece that was around being an Arab woman and that what the identity of an Arab woman meant, and that I did that through robotic clothing. And sort of I did a few of these projects that were really sort of about my own journey, my own ideas, and really at the intersection of art and technology. And then I started getting more interested in the idea of invention as a platform and a tool for others to empower communities. I moved to New York. I got involved with Creative Commons and I started getting very interested in open hardware and the idea of how do you enable innovation for people, for millions of people around the world, outside of a patent system that I found was really starting to get very co-opted by big companies with a lot of money. And that was a really interesting way to kind of meet a community of other fellow inventors that were doing research on and innovation on that topic. And in parallel, I started working on Little Bits, which became my company. Little Bits is a platform of very easy to use electronic building blocks. They have been likened to Lego. They snap together with magnets. They allow anyone without any background in engineering or technology to assemble circuits and to create electronic and software devices without any prior knowledge. And so you snap a few bits together and you can start making things come to life with light and sound and sensors and motors and computation. And really build up the way you would with Lego, starting, in a very intuitive fashion. I became more interested in this idea of not only being an inventor myself, but enabling others to be inventors and really empowering communities that are typically underrepresented in STEM and STEAM. And that means immigrants, it means girls, it means kids who have different ways of learning, who are not neurotypical, and Little Bits became a tool that we made available to families and homes through partnerships like Star Wars and Marvel and doing partnerships with Walmart and Target and various things, but also through making it available to schools through developing curriculum around it, around STEM and engineering and invention. And working with schools, around the country and the world to integrate this kind of playful learning into the classroom. I sold the company in 2019. Very proud of what we did together as a team. I think some of the things that I'm most proud of is when I get pictures of kids, adults as well, but kids are the ones that touch me the most when I receive pictures of kids that have little sketches like the ones that I used to have in my little ugly notebook, but they also have prototypes of their inventions, their remote control pet feeders, their wireless door alarms, their sibling buzzers, I noticed a lot of kids come up with ideas and prototypes that tackle world problems such as climate change, such as sustainability, such as bullying, things like that. It makes me really proud to see this aspect of invention having really enabled a community that I think otherwise would have not been able to do that. I now am, continuing to work in the field of education technology, but also picked up another passion on the way, which is more in activism. I started a nonprofit with some friends of mine focused on Lebanon, my country, the sort of popular revolution that's going on, to really help activists use technology and rise to power to be able to remove a very corrupt ruling class and be able to have a progressive government in place. So I'm sort of bringing a little bit more focus on sort of civic engagement and democracy on that front. But ultimately, I do think that all these tools really have a through line, which is meant to empower people to express themselves, to be change makers in their communities, to be able to collaborate on things that are larger than them, and to be able to be proud of invent the world that we live in, that we want to live in, as I used to say. So thank you so much, everybody, for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ayah. It's so wonderful to have both of you, and I think you're going to both bring some really interesting perspectives to this. So I'm going to try to kind of peel the onion, as it were, start a little bit with you guys each personally, and you can certainly talk with each other as well. I don't want this to be just me asking you questions, so please feel free to jump in with questions for each other as well. But I kind of wanted to start with that and get a little more about what Ashok has been working on, both in the past that we've documented here at the Smithsonian, and then some of his current work, and then get you both to talk a little more about those childhood inspirations, because I think that's a really key piece for inspiring young inventors, particularly. So we'll kind of do some of the more sort of personal, professional pieces, and then I want to get into some bigger questions around being an immigrant inventor and some of the challenges and positive aspects of that. So let me start with going to Ashok for a minute here, and can you talk a little more about the inspirations you got from India that helped spur sort of your work around UV waterworks and some other inventions you did then and are continuing perhaps to do?
One of the most important things I took away from India, and I still carry in my heart, is the lived experience of what is it to be from a developing country. I knew as growing up as a child that 5 of my cousins had died when they were young, in the first 3 years of life, of diarrhea disease. And I didn't know what it meant really. And it only dawned upon me later what is diarrheal disease, how it is transmitted, why children are susceptible to it, and why 5 of my cousins, all of them living in rural homes of my aunts and uncles, and what it might have meant for their parents to lose their children like that. So that led to my thinking about how can something as simple as safe drinking water be made available at an affordable price to people who are below the poverty line in India. People below the poverty line in India are really, really, really poor. And one of the things Indian government does is lower the poverty line once in a while, so there are fewer people under it. But that's a crooked way to claim that there are now more people above the poverty line. Not so straight. Anyways, so there was this epidemic of cholera in India in 1993. of a mutant strain that was not stoppable with standard cholera vaccine because it had a mutant exterior, so that the antibody generated by the vaccine wouldn't latch onto it. And tens of thousands of people died every month. In the summer of '93, it was called Bengal cholera. That is where it was discovered. It takes a couple of years, as we now know, even for modern world, to produce a vaccine in a big scale. Although we did a much better job with mRNA for COVID, of course. So I said, why can't we do something? I'm living here and doing my work at one of the greatest national labs, jewel in the crown in the national labs in the US. I was working at, then I still work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So in my spare time, on my own, in evenings, weekends, I ended up inventing something that is called UV Waterworks that disinfects water for a price that people below poverty line in India can afford. It was licensed by an American startup company, which is now serving 5 different countries, more than 20 million people a day. 80% of them below the poverty line. Is called Water Health. I have nothing to do with the company other than having been the inventor, and the university gave the license to the company, of course. But it was that most important thing that I carry with me as to how people live. Would they buy drinking water? Would they buy drinking water if it is affordable to them? Because buying drinking water was unthinkable then, and even the company that founded it couldn't had a little bit of cold feet to understand that people will buy drinking water if it keeps their kids safe and saves them diarrheal episodes. But that's what did work out. But that allowed me to understand how to use the enormous amount of science and engineering knowledge at our fingertips to solve some of the most desperate problems around the world, which often lie ignored because they are not as profitable as making an app or a new toy on the phone that will steal your data and sell it to some advertisers, right? That's far more profitable. But people, there is a spiritual payoff, if I may say so, in doing something that tries to make the world better. And the joy of doing that kind of invention far exceeds the joy of getting one more dollar in my bank. It's so obvious, but not everybody sees it that way. But for those of us see it that way, I can tell you this is extraordinary to be able to use science and technology and knowledge and creativity to solve problems that makes lives better is one of the most satisfying things I could have ever done with my life. And I'm so glad I'm doing it here in the US, which is set up in some ways to enable just that, rather than fighting bureaucracy all my life.
I want to get back to that because I think there's some interesting stuff around that issue, but I want to also get to Ayah for a second here. You talked some about your work and some of your inspirations and your interest in this art and technology and helping people as well. Obviously, social responsibility, social justice is big for you as well. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the aspects of your childhood in Beirut or your family or other cultural aspects may have sort of both supported your being a tinkerer as a child, but also your interest in what you do now?
Sure. Some of the stories that Ashok mentioned actually resonate with me. I felt sorry to hear about your relatives that died at a young age. I didn't have exactly that, but you know, Lebanon is also a developing country, and there were and continue to be a lot of problems that are really avoidable, that lead to health problems, death, injustice in all its kinds because of simple either governmental or invention and sort of product innovation that didn't exist. So I grew up in a world that was sort of, if you want, suffered from a little bit of a multiple personality disorder. On one hand, Lebanon and Beirut is a very cosmopolitan city. People are well educated, well traveled. It's in the middle, you know, between what they call East and West, and is a very urban and progressive city. And on the other hand, we are the country, like I said, is a developing country in the middle of the Arab world, always strife with violence and problems. And so you really get to see both sides of the coin. And I think in a sense, that was a big inspiration. You know, you are able to see problems in reality. You are not removed. You are not sheltered. You are not, you know, you are not disconnected from the realities of problems in society, but at the same time you do see that there are better ways. You have exposure to sort of world universities and companies and other ways of doing things. So I think, you know, in that sense, that was, you know, I was able to form an opinion that I could see problems, but I could also see myself solving them. You know, my specific personal inspirations, you know, little bits, you can draw a very direct line from little bits. You can draw a very direct line to it from my personality. I'm you know, love to play, love to sort of have fun. And for me, creativity was always very important. And the way I learned engineering was really marking to me. It was the opposite of everything that I thought it was going to be. Engineering should be fun. Technology, STEM, STEAM should be fun, empowering, energizing, should lead to curiosity. It should really be intoxicating. It should be something that everybody strives to be in. Not everybody, of course, but that many people strive to be in. And instead, I found this aspect of technology and STEM learning that was really about sort of learning other methods of doing things and replicating them and doing multiple choice and really no innovation and creativity. And I found that to be really at odds with what it could be. So, you know, Little Bits was a direct outcome of my protest to that, if you like, and I tapped into a world that I noticed was a lot bigger than me. You know, decades of research around learning through play that had been proven to be effective and successful, and you know, and should be more widespread. And I think more of it is happening today. I think other inspirations, particularly around social impact, really come from, you know, always trying to keep a pulse on where we are in the world. I have a big criticism of the technology industry that particularly, you know, I think guilty of it is our inventors and technologists that are, you know, many of the biggest companies born in the US and particularly in Silicon Valley and generally these bubbles that are creating platforms that reach the entire world and have impact on the entire world, but really are not in touch with the responsibility that comes with creating such powerful tools. And so it's sort of become my mission / obsession to preach the gospel to everybody that, you know, technology today is one of the most powerful tools you get to be in and to help create. And so it is urgent that we have more diversity in technology creators, in technology leaders, in technology inventors. It is critical for humankind, for there to be more opinions around the table, people, inventors and creators and designers to be more exposed in their life, to really have a closer pulse on reality so that they can know the impact of what they're inventing is on the world. And so I think, you know, to tie it to really the topic of today, one of the best ways to do that is to have more teams and schools and companies that involve more immigrant inventors and people from different countries and cultures and genders and sexualities and opinions, so that you really get that diversity of opinion around the table and you're able to create better products, better tools, better inventions, better solutions to these problems that are global.
Well, that leads to a very good segue for us to talk about, I think, the diversity issue both from an immigration standpoint, but I also think that what you're also saying about gender, sexuality, all these other issues that bring new perspectives to the table. So either both of you, I'd love just to have you talk a little more about what is the positive impact of diversity? How have you seen it make a more innovative product or process, or what the lived experience of this would be really great to hear.
May I?
Yes, please.
Please.
I truly think that diversity is welcoming, including, empowering people of all backgrounds is critical to really let more talent in, and to exclude people simply based because they don't look like us or they don't talk like us or any of those caricatured othering of people will only reduce the pool of creativity and talent that we can draw on. There are two aspects to this, right? One is the societal structures which allow creativity to flower. And I think Jared Diamond talks about this in his beginning chapters on guns, germs, and steel, about how people in, I think, Papua New Guinea are as smart as anybody else he has met in Los Angeles. Except they don't have the institutions and they don't have the societal setups, the structures to allow that to flower. They feel they have to live hand to mouth on it. So not only are people tremendously creative all around the world, but you can suffocate them, you can exclude them, and you can say, oh, we'll only allow this narrow slice to open our doors to them. And that simply reduces the pool which we are able to draw on. In my experience, this resonates very strongly with my experience in Berkeley. In somewhat contrasting ways, I came here with a tremendous burden of growing up in India, where every single thing I touched, which was man-made, had been invented abroad. The pencils which I wrote in school were invented abroad. The trains on which Indians traveled, invented abroad. The planes in the sky we could look at, invented abroad. Radio, electric light, even electricity generation, cars, you name it, invented abroad. I felt so disempowered. I couldn't imagine being an inventor. But I still wanted to know how it works anyway. So I took to physics, and pretty much like Ayah said, engineering was a mind-killing thing. I avoided it at all costs, because at that time, engineering in India was only how to be a maintenance engineer of something that is brought in from outside. You would be a highly paid mechanic trying to do maintenance and repair, not inventing and building anything new, designing nothing new. That's really a mind-numbing kind of education. Also, it didn't go deep enough at foundations of why things work. It was always about keeping the factory running. God forbid. And same thing was true about the highly attractive educational channels into which parents directed their kids, which used to be basically look for job security and look for good income. And it would be either medicine or engineering. And I avoided them at all costs. And some of my relatives would tell my parents, oh, too bad, your son is studying physics, it'll be all right. He will figure out some kind of profession one of these days. That surely was the farthest of my problems. But they took it that I was studying physics because I couldn't get into engineering. But there it was. So there is, unfortunately, killing of talent in multiple ways. Talent is easy to suffocate and kill, either by excluding them from having access to opportunities, and that is where diversity comes in, or from channeling talent into safe directions and not allowing people the taking of the risk to do something. Physics is not a profession. What the hell will you do when you get a physics degree? You will only teach other people. That's not true though, but that's because nobody had seen a physicist in my family. My parents were kind enough to allow me to do nutty things like that, and I'm really grateful.
What about you, Ayah? I mean, as both a woman and someone who did engineering and is now, working in technology to help others, what are some of the things you've faced and seen in terms of diverse teams and their the positive aspects of that we should all know about?
Well, being a woman in STEM is a test of patience in itself. I think in the US, last I read, 87% of professionals in STEM are white and Asian males. And so, you're in every room, you're a minority. And then you add to it the fact that I'm Arab, that's, also very much a minority. So I sort of learned to, accept this as a reality, and talk about what I, bring differently to the table when I had the opportunity to. Obviously, that takes a position of privilege to do that. I came in to the United States with means to be here, to study, to get a visa, I spoke the language fluently. I, graduated with a degree from a good school. That opens doors to you that if you are an immigrant starting off from really, the bottom of the totem pole becomes a lot harder to do. So I feel lucky to have lived this experience. I don't take it for granted. And I think that a lot more work has to be done to enable people that are starting with less opportunities, because it's exponentially harder for an immigrant to do that. In terms of what is the value of diversity when it comes to sort of invention and innovation, there's the academic view that decades of research has proven that diversity in projects in research leads to better quality work. I think a few years ago, Google published one of its largest studies on what are the most effective teams that, through their own doing the research internally, the most effective teams and projects that came out of Google always shared two things in common. One, diversity of the teams, and two, psychological safety, which means people, it's not only that there are diverse opinions around the table and people and ethnic backgrounds, but also they have to feel psychologically safe to express those views and to bring their identity to the table. And so I think there's all the studies that prove how much better quality work comes out when you do invest in diversity. But there's also I guess the extreme view of that, which is the danger that happens when you don't have it. So it's not just about producing better work, it's about the risk of producing nefarious work if you don't have it. So also from Google, there have been many scandals over the past few years that have been directly linked to a lack of diversity around the technology teams. I think most recent story has been that was a few years ago, but when Google Images, when Google reverse image search was being used, and a Black person was uploading their photos, and they would get relevant or similar photos displayed, and they were photos of gorillas, and so you have these examples of racism and bias and really dangerous content allowed to happen, because on the teams that tested image search when they were launching it, there wasn't enough diversity of skin color to be able to make sure that the algorithm was working right. And so we are in a world now where these problems become bigger because technology reach is bigger. artificial intelligence reach is exponential and self-fulfilling. And so if you don't have the problem solved at the root, they end up exponentially getting worse. So it's not only about doing better work, it's also about not doing harm. And that's what makes it, to me, urgent and really a responsibility that we all have to solve it at the root.
Yeah. Well, to that point, I mean, can you talk a little bit, both of you, about some of the challenges you faced yourselves as immigrant inventors, and maybe how, through your experiences, you talk with your teams, with your students, with your colleagues about how to deal with some of those challenges when you face them in the workplace?
May I?
Please go ahead.
So in my team, my research team at Berkeley, which comprises mostly of non-whites, I make it a point to ensure the kind of psychological safety that Ayah correctly pointed out. We have more women than men in my research team. And there is an assurance that not trying is a crime. Failing is not a crime. If you just sit on your hands and don't try, then you're in the wrong place. But failing is okay. That's part of being eventually successful. So Ayah is so right in pointing out the importance of initiative, importance of tolerance, importance of psychological safety. And you can attack, and you must attack ideas or oppose ideas, but you never attack or oppose people. All this is old stuff for people who read management books, but surprisingly, it is not internalized in research teams. And a certain level of tension and hostility and putting people in a pressure cooker is seen as a way to get most out of it, but it's not really true. Personally, I've had, in my experience, Americans are an extremely generous people. People with whom I've interacted have been generous, and only rarely I've run into, once in a while, as a graduate student, I ran once in a while into somebody from faculty who would say, oh, in my earshot, speaking to another person, purposely so that I will hear, all these Asians come with rote learning and are able to spit out rote learned answers and not have an iota of creativity. And they will do well in their exams, but wait till you put them to the test. And they unfortunately just do well and well and well in our exams here. And it was intended at me, and I ignored it. You have to roll some of these things off your back like water on a lotus leaf, as they say. Don't let it worry you. I'm fine. But in general, Americans are very, very generous and decent people to work with. And I am very pleased to be in this country as an immigrant and call this country as my country. And I realize that when I treat this country as my country and I call myself American, not only I lay claim to what is good in America, but I also lay claim to the baggage of the wrongs that we have done to the African Americans, to the Native Americans, to the LGBTQ community and others. And I must carry that burden and do what I can to right the wrong like other Americans. So I carry that with me as well. So that's the other angle. I can't simply say, hey, I'm an immigrant. I didn't have anything to do with the slavery here. That's not the right thing to do. That's how I think about it.
Do you feel like, if I can just follow up, do you feel like you had the psychological safety at Berkeley and that's why you stayed there, or why you returned there from India? Was that part of, you felt welcome as an immigrant that you might not have in other parts of even the US, let alone other countries?
I don't have direct experience, but I have indirect experience from my colleagues, non-white colleagues who are stellar scientists. A Korean American close colleague of mine was offered a tenured faculty position in the part of the US where there are no Asian Americans. And his wife is a white American woman, but when they went to visit, he felt he was being stared at everywhere they went. He felt treated not as he would in Berkeley, for example. And he said, I don't care. I would rather be in Berkeley where, being diverse is like being in New York. So there are places which are more welcoming and there are places that still are less welcoming, for sure, for people who are not looking like white Americans.
What about you, Ayah? You want to speak to that?
I think, in school, I think MIT did better than other schools in terms of that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I think MIT has less of a legacy except admissions problems than some of the other schools, which oftentimes is really tied to a lot of kind of bias in admissions. MIT has a little bit more representation, in obviously technology and science, which tends to, to bring in a little bit more diversity than a lot of more humanities and business. I'm saying generalizations, but slightly better, I would say, slightly better than other schools. And friends that I had were in other schools would, did point out stories where they were sort of worse off. Women representation at MIT was not good. At the Media Lab, women representation was not good at all. If I remember correctly, I was the first Arab woman Arab in the Media Lab, and I think certainly Arab woman, but Arab in the Media Lab, maybe second, but I'm pretty sure I was the first. So, and there are 200 million Arabs in the world, so it's a large number. So some of these things have improved. In my company, you sort of talking about diversity on the team was, I don't want to say a mandate, it was a way of life. Right before I sold the company, I think 60% of my executive team was women and LGBTQ, if I'm not mistaken. Our team was around 40% women, and our products were designed, and this was a founding principle of the product, was gender neutral. And we did this in 2000. We started in 2008 before there was a company, but the company was founded in 2011. Gender neutrality in toys and educational toys is not an easy thing to do. We had arguments with retailers about it. We had arguments with licensors about it. The idea of really being gender neutral, not fitting into the pink aisle or the blue aisle, or having a label on top of it, boys ages 8 to 12, we didn't have that. And we intentionally wrote gender neutral and intentionally had invention examples that were not cars and princess outfits. They were Ferris wheels, and they were pet feeders, and they were bubble blowers, and they were things that were really gender free and gender neutral. And as a result, and because we did that work, we had about 40% of our user base was girls, which is unheard of in a robotics and electronics platform. Lego, which the large majority of Lego products are not even technological, had about 10% of its user base was girls. at the time. Now they're doing a lot better on those fronts. So it was a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work. When we did the partnership with Star Wars, the Lucasfilm team at the time told us that about 10% of the Star Wars products were bought by girls, and we worked very hard to make sure that the products that we designed were inviting to both girls and boys, and I think we reached about 37% when we were measuring last. So it doesn't take just saying it, it takes intending it, it takes building into your values as a company, it takes building it into your principles of design as a product, it takes putting it into the team that you build, it takes measuring. When you put something out, you have to measure the impact, and you have to course correct when you are wrong. I think Ashok says something really important, is like the crime is not to try, the crime is not to fail, because you fail and you admit the failure and you make it better. When we first started with the product, we hadn't achieved those numbers yet, and we kept working on it until we did. And we would invite groups of kids, and we would measure, and we would ask them questions, and we would get feedback, and we would adjust. And sometimes we would let go of key features in the product that we were very attached to, that we'd spent a lot of time and money on, and we would let go of them because there was a bigger principle. So it takes it's almost cliche to say, but it takes doing the work to get the result. And there is no shortcuts. There is no way around it. There are no shortcuts. You invest the work, you invest the time, and you measure, and you keep iterating until you get to a point that you like, and then you just do it regularly after that.
That's great. I just got a great question from the audience member, so I wanted to bring it to you both. Damon says, my daughter is studying computer science at university and is facing a persistent male chauvinism in her classes. Can the panelists talk about personal struggles against persistent biases by classmates or workmates and how they succeeded despite the challenges?
I'm happy to take that. It's very, very, very familiar with the problem, unfortunately. I think, there's a lot of there are a lot of schools of thought on this issue. My personal opinion, and what has worked for me, is first and foremost to know that it is happening, to expect it, and it's sort of, it's sort of, when you go out of the house and it's cloudy, you expect that it's going to rain. You sort of are going into these environments, you expect you are going to be faced with some sexism and misogyny. And so when it happens, you're like, oh, here it is, we're now here. And not to be surprised, because I think being surprised by it, and sometimes being sort of taken back by asking yourself, like, did this just happen? Was this awkward? Was this wrong? That takes up a lot of cycles of energy that I think are not helpful. When you expect that it's going to happen, it's less likely to hurt you in your self-confidence, which is, I think, one of the most dangerous places that these things can affect you. It affects your self-confidence and your self-worth, and it causes you, women in particular, in this case, to retreat. And so I think acknowledging and expecting it to occur is sort of the first thing. The second thing is really this is a case-by-case situation. If this is a person in power, if this is a professor, a research assistant, somebody who has sort of authority, then it's important to address that with the body of the school, because this person has authority over you and the class, and any bias has sort of a multiplier effect on the class and yourself and your success in that class. If this person is a classmate, I think you'd have to assess if this was somebody that is open to feedback, or somebody that is going to cause problems. And I think on a case-by-case basis, you would either take the person aside and address it and say, this, what you said made me uncomfortable, and it felt like it was directed at me because of my gender, etc. I would appreciate you not saying that. Or if it's something more nefarious, then maybe also taking it up with the school. But it really is hard to kind of give advice individually. I think the best thing you could do is sort of, accept your own identity, your own power, accept the circumstances we're in, and do what you can to not let it affect you, knowing that that's not always possible. Yeah.
Can I just ask, actually, Ashok, when you deal with this, because you have women on your team, do you see this and do you step in, or do you have any suggestions for how others can sort of step in if they see this happening?
I fully agree with what I explained, that it is a case-by-case matter, but ultimately, as the leader of the research team and as a faculty member, or as a faculty research scientist, senior scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, in my research team at a lab as well, it is very important to make clear that discriminatory comments are not acceptable, and discriminatory behavior or racist behavior or comments of the kind that hurt people because of their nationality, gender identity, color. These are, I mean, look, in the law, we have something called protected categories, okay? But a lot of people don't internalize that this is the way we have to behave on a daily basis. So when that does come up, you have to, if I'm the leader of the team, I have to be very clear that despite the outstanding brilliance of the person in question, this dimension of their behavior is so unacceptable that they either have to figure out with me how to fix it, or they have to move on. We can't be together. So for example, let me give one example, yeah? There was a member of my team who ridiculed a Chinese student when several years ago, when China lost a soccer match in the international sphere, saying, oh, you are 1.2 billion Chinese and you can't even produce a soccer team worth of good players who can beat France, for example. And the Chinese student got really, really upset. It was not his fault. It's about the historical situation, okay? And he complained about it. And I had to speak to this person saying, this is not on, you can't do this and stay here. You got to apologize. And you don't understand how it is taken from somebody who comes from a developing country to be put down in these particular ways. And do you know that when the Chinese were developing written language and they had domesticated agriculture and they invented paper and gunpowder, what the Europeans were doing? I don't want to go there, but be aware.
So I would love to get more into this, especially on the gender issue, because of course, as a woman, I find this interesting. But we have another really good question from the audience. And this is again for both of you. Thanks to Ashok and Ayah for a fascinating conversation. So can you say a bit more about your transnational experiences and its influence on your inventive work? In other words, it sounds like it's never a one-way trip from your home country to the US, but often shuttling back and forth between nations. Thanks.
You want to take that, Ayah, first?
Sure. It's definitely a shuttling back and forth situation. I've been in the US now, the last time I counted was 16 years. And I think over the 16 years that I've been in the US, I've gone back and forth to Lebanon probably twice a year, sometimes once a year, but probably twice a year, a couple of times even more. And so I've kept quite close in touch, and a lot of my family is still there. So I do have quite a big connection still there. And I've done a reasonable amount of projects and partnerships in the rest of the Arab world as well. So not just Lebanon, but in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, etc. And so, you know, there's a transnational experience. I'm doing more of that now. I've gotten very interested in specifically the entrepreneurship scene in the Arab world. You know, the Arab world, like I said, is over 200 million people, but about 75% of the population is under the age of 25. So there's a really young population. They're really exposed. They're, you know, in many places very progressive, and really want to sort of improve their societies and make them work better. And entrepreneurship is one of the methods to do that. And so there's a really thriving entrepreneurship scene in many of these countries that I'm very interested in and really getting more and more exposed to. In the past, it used to be a lot of the exchange used to be like everything is better, a little bit like what Ashok was saying in his first intervention. Everything was invented in the West, everything is better in the West, and we import it to the Middle East. And so this used to be the case, but now more and more you see the younger generation saying, no, we invent things that are for our local economies and local societies and local cultures. And I really like that. I like to encourage it. And so I mentor where I can, or I participate, or I, you know, have been part of judging competitions with VCs and things like that. And that's an area where I think my sort of dual experience really does bring value, and hopefully will continue to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I will add that a lot of my work is transnational in character, both ways, flows both ways. Some of my work for the last 15, 20 years is about removing arsenic from drinking water. Arsenic is it is the single most toxic, carcinogenic contaminant among all the contaminants permitted in water by the US EPA or WHO. And my team invented a way to remove it affordably, effectively, at a very low cost. And we tried that first in Bangladesh, and it was next to impossible. So we went to India, which was hard, but we could do it. It scaled up, and now we want to bring it back to California. So in some ways, the science, technology, and the chemistry, all the core underlying stuff, translates easily. The same laws of physics and chemistry and engineering and science work across. But culturally, the expectations and the community placement and the importance of working with community leaders and gaining their trust, that also translates across in the sense that the core principles are, you can't parachute down into a community and try to solve their problem if they treat you as an outsider with a return air ticket who's going to fly away, and they're stuck with whatever junk you leave in their backyard. That doesn't work. Same thing applies when we took fuel efficient stoves to the refugee camps in Darfur. And it was a lot of work with the local community leaders, working through their channels to gain their trust, to undertake demonstrations, to ensure that if they don't like it, they're able to give it back, and it's fine. So, and is a co-designing of the technology, because the final hardware must meet their cultural and practical expectations of how they are going to use a cook stove in a kitchen in a refugee camp in Darfur. Mm-hmm. So the final engineering product has a whole lot of heat transfer and mechanical engineering under the hood, but how it feels to the driver has to be comfortable to the woman cook who's doing the cooking. So that's also part of the design that we have to learn to integrate. So it gives me a lot of appreciation of importance of cultural humility, that no single person going from this or that culture should wade in to another one with the level of arrogance saying, oh, we come from country X and we know what's good for you. That's a recipe for a disaster.
Well, on that note, I want to halt here for a second. We have another question from the audience, but We have a bonus for this session, which is that Curator Emeritus Peter Leapold is here to show us some materials from the collections related to immigrant inventors. So I want to give him a chance to present some of those, because I think that will also maybe engender some questions. And then we'll come back and have about 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so let's go to Peter. I will just quickly introduce him. As I said, he's a Curator Emeritus at the National Museum of American History, where he's focused on industrial history and working class life. And he's done so many wonderful exhibits. I won't list them all, but they're very related to this topic, including American Enterprise, which is currently on display, Bittersweet Harvest, the Bracero program, Forgotten Workers, Chinese immigrant workers in the Transcontinental Railroad, The Only One in the Room, Women Achievers in Business and the Challenges of Success, and Asian American Immigration After Exclusion. So that's just a taste of the stuff he's done. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's really a pleasure to be part of this presentation. Immigrant Inventors is a fabulous topic. This entire symposium really is providing wonderful insights and perspectives. And what I'd like to do is take you on a brief tour into the treasure house, into what the Smithsonian holds at some of the artifacts, so that everyone can think about what is there, how they can access it, and in fact, what else the museum should collect. So if we look at our first slide, we can see that a little bit about Samuel Slater. The National Museum of American History collections are really deep. There are over 1.8 million artifacts. And of course, the Smithsonian across its other bureaus has even more. And so much of these artifacts give insight to motivations, motivations for inventions and motivations for migration. And so as we look at these artifacts, we can get a sense of what some of these motivations are all about. The Samuel Slater was born in 1768, died in 1835 in Devonshire, England. He was indentured to Jedediah Strutt at age 10 in the textile mills, learned the trade, and at age 21 was enticed to come to the United States. In England, Slater is known as Slater the Trader because he took trade secrets with him in his head. And he came to the U.S., eventually ended up at working for Moses Brown in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And here you can see the Slater frame, thought to be one of the first factories in the United States. Moving on to our next slide, another great inventor that people may not always think about as an immigrant is Alexander Graham Bell. Bell he moved around quite a lot, actually born in Scotland in 1847. Then moved, he and his family moved to England, from England to Canada, and from Canada to the United States. And his movement was really motivated often by work. His attitude towards invention, he was prolific as an inventor. Here you can see just one of the artifacts we have, the demonstration of a telephone at the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition. And the collection is really rich with many, many objects related to sound and communication that Bell developed. Moving on to our next slide, we have Leo Baekeland. He was born in 1863 in Ghent, Belgium, and trained as a scientist, started working in a university, and came to the United States on a travel scholarship award, and was talked into staying. So again, a sort of opportunistic kind of situation. Baekeland is really known for two great big inventions. One is Velox, photographic paper. He was a chemist. Used that money to set up a company to make Bakelite, one of the early plastics. And here you can see a plastic bow. And if we go to our next slide, you can see a variety of other objects, the Bakelizer, the factory, a little piece of tradelet. Tradelet is a treasure of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has one of the biggest collections of trade literature, and it's something that researchers use extensively. And of course, above that, you can see one of Baekeland's notebooks. The archival holdings in the Leo Baekeland collection are really vast. And so there's a lot of primary material to look at there. Now, if we go on to our next slide, you can see that we don't always look at dead white men. That Samuel Slater, Alexander Graham Bell, Leo Baekeland sort of fit a very old-fashioned view of inventors. And the new guard of the Smithsonian is really looking further afield. Here, of course, we see Ayah Bdeir, who is with us today and just has fantastic insights. I would call Ayah's perspective that of being inspirational. She's an inventor that is about inspiring other people, very overtly to inspire other people. She appears in our Portraits of Women Inventors show, which just went up. And we haven't collected anything from Ayah yet. And this is sort of an interesting challenge for people to think about. If you were a curator at the Smithsonian, what would you collect? Would you collect oral history? Would you collect prototypes, finished products? What are all of those objects that should be collected? Now we'll move on to the next slide. We see H. Joseph Gerber. Joe Gerber came to the United States fleeing to persecution. He was Jewish growing up in Austria, born in 1924, and he was his chances of surviving had he stayed in Nazi-occupied Austria were very slim. Very charismatic, entrepreneurial individual, came to the United States. All of his work revolves around the concept of turning numbers into shapes and shapes into numbers. And you can actually see his first invention, which is in the top of the screen, that sort of funny looking white thing. And that's the elastic band out of his pajamas. And he was going to school, had to do a lot of engineering math problems, and basically figured out a way to cheat on his homework by turning the elastic band into a little computer to solve some of the complex mathematical equations. He turns that elastic band into his first saleable invention, the variable scale, which is right below it. And then later has a whole host of different types of pieces. The Gerber cutter was used to numerically cut fabric in garment shops. So really a fascinating person, but his motivation for coming to the US was so much different than that of others. Now, if we move on to our next slide, you can see again Ashok Gadgil, who really a pleasure to listen to in person. There is the invention that we've mentioned, the UV waterworks, that really puts him in such a strong place as a humanitarian inventor. Really, a driving force is to make the world a better place, and all of his work revolves around those humanitarian kinds of perspectives. But along with his objects and papers being in the Smithsonian collections, he actually has come quite often and participated in programs. And this is really the public programs that the museum does. We're now doing them virtually, but I'm sure when the pandemic is over that we'll return to doing them in person. Creates such an incredibly inspirational moment for so many people to see that they too can be inventors, they too can develop things. Moving to the next slide, we have Yogiswaran Ganes, born in 1980, of course, still alive, a a photolithography engineer. He was born in Madras, India. And interestingly, I had talked about visas a little bit earlier on, and visas are very, very important. How people actually can come to the United States to go to school, to work, whether they're on a work program or whether they can actually have a path to citizenship is really interesting. Yogi came to the U.S. On an F1 visa, which is to attend graduate school. He then converted to an H-1B, which there's no road to citizenship on H-1B. It's strictly you're here for specialized work. But he was able to convert to an EB-1A, which is often called the genius visa. That he has many patents, and it makes him so important that there's a visa category that put him onto a path to citizenship. And yesterday there was a lot of talk about H-1Bs and whether the right to stay or not to stay motivates people to invent or not. And it is a very complicated topic. Moving on to our next slide, we have a different kind of inventor. Shigeumi Tachibi is a chef. He was born in Japan, trained in Italy, very successful in Japan. And he comes to the United States on an E2 visa, which is an investor visa. So he came to set up and operate a high-end restaurant, Shaya Brasserie in Beverly Hills, and really invents a new style of food that is fusion, looking at a combination of sushi, traditional in Japan, with other Asian and Western influences, and really different kind of look for food. But his motivation was that, and what made it possible was finance. So again, a different kind of operating situation. Our next slide, we have an older immigrant, Manuel de la Peña, who comes to the United States. Not much is known about Peña, and here we have a patent model for a typesetting machine. And the patent at the time, he is listed as being of Argentina citizenship, but living in the United States. The patent models are vast quantities, over 10,000 patent models in the National Museum of American History collections. And so much work can be done using those to gain insight into different inventors. And our very last inventor that I'd like to talk about, the next slide, please, is Ryuichi Ishii, who is a classic sojourner. Sojourners are Ryuichi Ishii was bored with Japan. He wanted less restrictions. He wanted more excitement. Came to the United States as a college student. Took up accounting, worked in a food company, and invents supermarket sushi. Really a totally different kind of concept. Hadn't been done anywhere else, and really revolutionized all about logistics, all about branding and trade pieces. But again, a different kind of story. And with that, I'd like to return it back to the participants, who can think about objects, what they tell us, and what they think we should collect.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was great. We really appreciate your pinch hitting for us today. So I guess, yeah, I mean, first to Ayah and Ashok, do you want to comment? I know, especially Ashok, you have something in our collection, and Ayah, you've now got a very subtle, not so subtle, push to contribute your collections eventually to the Smithsonian. So you want to talk about sort of the importance of the technical stuff and using it, having it somewhere where it's useful for future generations?
I think my comment is, oh, sorry, Ashok, go ahead.
I was going to simply comment on a remark that evidently came up in the previous session about the H-1 visas and inventing. I came here on an F-1 as a student, as a graduate student, went back to India, came here back here on H-1, just with a PhD, and didn't stop me from inventing, and I didn't invent for getting a green card. Inventing is such a powerful inside thing in your heart and in your head that when it takes hold of you, when you see a problem and you have an idea for a solution to the problem in your back pocket, it won't let you sleep. It is like a demon that takes possession of your head and your brain and your mind, and that's all you kind of can think about. And it is a relentless internal pressure to invent because you know you have a solution, or you think you have a solution, and you got to try, and you could fail or not fail, but you must try. And that is almost a internal compulsion, okay? It is not for you at that point. It is also a creative force inside you that is compelling you to go and try because you think you know that it's gonna work. And it may not work, of course, after all, but you don't invent for the sake of getting a green card. Nah, that's not my experience. Inventing is a very weird demon inside your head. And that's why you invent.
Ayah, do you want to add anything or respond otherwise to what?
Yeah, I'm laughing because the demon in your head is something that I very much resonate with. Anytime I'm talking to an entrepreneur who's sort of basing their next company on an idea or an invention, I tell them if it's not waking you up in the middle of the night, if you're not obsessed about it, if you don't see every single thing in your life, social, emotional, or other, through the lens of that obsession, I wouldn't recommend, embarking on it, because you really do need that kind of singular focus on this invention, and it really does take a hold of you. So that's something that resonates with me. I appreciated the review of all the different kinds of inventors. I will take the nudge. In fact, the prototype that you showed on the left side with the cardboard prototype is something that I have, so we should talk about whether that could be the candidate. I think it's so important to showcase these inventions and these inventors. The exhibit that the Smithsonian put together about women inventors was really well received, and hopefully someday will be able to happen in person, because I received lots of comments and messages from young kids saying that they were inspired by it, and parents saying that their kids were inspired by it because they see somebody that looks like them, and it really matters. And I think more and more over the past few years, we've realized, and many people have started to really put the spotlight on some of the most influential inventions of our world having been invented by underrepresented inventors and just not credited. And so there are many inventors that we use every day. The most recent example I read, actually, it was an interesting article, is about the at-home pregnancy test, is credited to be invented by Marcel Wanders, if I'm not mistaken. And in fact, it was invented by a woman, I actually forget her name now, who had invented it and fought for it for many years, and she's just not credited with it anywhere, and never made money from it. And so these stories, it's one thing to display the ones that we do sort of hear about. It's even more important to dig in for the ones that we don't hear about. And I think this is a little bit of a nudge back to the Smithsonian to say this is worthwhile research, and it's important that you're doing it, and please continue to peel back the onion and put your attention and resources where others can't. find those stories that are under reported.
Well, thank you so much, Ayah, because that's something that the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation that's hosting this today, that's a big part of our mission, is trying to uncover, document, research, and disseminate stories about the not the usual suspects, right? So we really appreciate that. And with that, we only have a few minutes. So I'm going to actually combine the last audience question and my questions, and you can decide how you want to answer this in the 4 minutes we have between the two of you. So the question from the audience was, do you think that the immigrant experience, your exposure to different people, ideas, culture, languages, products, et cetera, helps you be more creative, helps you with your invention process? So that's part one. And the part I want to add as a sort of thought-provoking is, do you think we'll ever see the day where everyone is just listed as an inventor, a scientist, an engineer, without a modifier in front of it, without a woman inventor or Asian American inventor, or whatever that may be? So those are the two-part questions there for you.
May I take it quick answers? The second one is easier for me to answer. I think the reason we want to label inventors or engineers or scientists as women or LGBTQ or immigrants is because they are from categories that are underrepresented relative to their potential contributions. Once it is all homogenized, we no longer begin to distinguish them, and that day may or may not come, depends on us, whether we go in that direction or not, right? But at one time, I point out that Italian Americans were discriminated against, right? No longer you have to always say somebody's an Italian American in baseball. So I hope that day comes. It depends on us. I think for everybody, there is a deep pool of knowledge and experience on which you draw in your inventing. And for those of us who are immigrants or transcultural, international immigrants or multilingual, we have diverse universes from which we can draw. So I could argue that it makes us little more, our pool from which we can draw becomes a little richer. But that's not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is really, how do we encourage people to become inventors? And how do we set up social structures that don't exclude people because of their skin color, gender, or identity, or because they look different? And I think it's a tremendously important thing for the country as a whole, for society, for the world, to let creativity loose on solving difficult problems. And inventing is part of that dimension, which you can't simply get out of standard textbooks, because it's creativity. You can't put it in a box.
Literally thinking outside the box, right? So what about you, Ayah? How do you want to wrap up your?
I am a little similar to Ashok. I'm not as irritated by the what did you call it? Definer? The
labels.
Yeah, I'm not as annoyed by the label that says female inventor or black inventor, something like that, because if our intentions are good, it does help, because it helps you sort of identify who you want to over-index and feature because you've not featured them in the past. It's annoying, definitely, and I would, I often prefer not to be sort of part of these groups just, because of quota, but in some sense, society has to overcorrect right now, and so I'm not as annoyed by that as I am about other stuff. I think the more important thing is I am surprised that the conversation around are quotas necessary? Are we doing reverse discrimination? Is is affirmative action important or is it wrong? That conversation I'm really tired about. You know, I get into this debate with people sometimes that are arguing against affirmative action, and I'm like, I would like to know your, you know, solution. Otherwise, well, how else do we correct for decades of systemic racism, sexism, and underrepresentation? I would like to know what the alternative is. It's easy to sit down and criticize. So I'm less sort of, I guess, you know, annoyed by the form, more annoyed by the actual mechanisms through which we get to a solution. So as always, and as I mentioned before, you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So it's sort of not debatable to me that you have to do sanity checks on the demographics in the groups that you lead, whether companies, organizations, conferences, etc. You cannot improve what you don't measure. And there is a reason that there are fewer underrepresented inventors, entrepreneurs, engineers, etc. around you, is because they are either self-selecting or being selected out of the pools by the time they reach you. And so you do have to reach farther into the pipeline, farther down in other places. It is work. There is work to be done, and there is no way around it. So I just sort of bring back the question to are you really committed to this? And if you are, you just have to allocate the time and energy and people to it. And the payoff is huge. It's huge in terms of dynamics in a team, in terms of cultural richness, outcome of the work, and also in mitigating some really bigger problems that could potentially face we could potentially face as a society. So I'm very staunch enthusiast about this, and I commend people who are doing it and fighting the good fight, and tell them to keep doing it.
Well, I can't imagine a better note to wrap this up on. You two have been just fabulous. Your passion and your creativity and your enthusiasm is just amazing. So thank you so much. I also want to thank my colleague Peter for bringing out the collections. And I just want to remind everyone, if you find this interesting, please join us tomorrow as well. Same time, same bat channel. You just have to register for it separately. Here's the information. And so it's about current debates around innovation, law, and policy, some of which have been sort of touched on today. But again, thank you so much to the panelists, Ashok and Ayah, and to Peter, and to all of you, the audience. You've been wonderful. And thank you for sticking with us, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.